Shall we start? Because we've got our friend and supporter from afar, and it's a miracle, really. I mean, let's just be honest, it's a miracle. We got a hybrid Zoom meeting, people remotely, people here, live stream on Facebook, fed downstairs, and it's almost worked, yeah? That wasn't the plan. The plan was 90 people in the room here and just deal with it. But it's a model for the future. Hybrid meetings, broadcasting to the world, Facebook, etc., and getting great people. And I must say, when I signed up to this, my dream was to get Peter Oborne, Asa Winstanley, and then last night I heard Lowkey, and I can't believe that we've done it. I'm going to start with Peter because he takes a long run up, Peter. Peter and I may have a laugh about how we sat opposite each other. Will we?
Yeah, well,
in the Sunday Express building. For 6 months, I was there for 6 months, Peter, opposite each other in my last moments in Fleet Street, yeah? But I must say, I've totally admired what Peter has done in the years since. I've got a great career behind me, but Peter's got a great career here. And if ever you see his tweets, if ever you read him on the web, if you ever see him on, I think it was Sky News and Pakistan and in what more, don't get him going about cricket. But what I want to hear from Peter, if I may, is broadly to discuss the need for an alternative media, because Peter's written great stuff about the EHRC, about the attacks on Jeremy Corbyn, about stuff going on in the Middle East. He was going to be in Damascus, but he's not. He's elsewhere. But I'm really grateful. So Peter, as we agreed the other night, just say what you want to say for 10 minutes, and I'm grateful. Thank you.
Well, Greg, it's. I hope you could. Can you hear me? Just checking. First of all,
you're the second person in 2 days that's going. Can you hear me? Of course we can, because we're multimedia.
Well, it's lovely to see you again, Greg, after all these years when we worked for Mr. Desmond.
Did we? I didn't know that.
Yes, well, maybe I got. Maybe yes, he was a notable figure who purchased the Express. Maybe yeah. Anyway.
People are watching this, Peter. Peter, okay?
It's not a private company. But you asked me to talk about the need for an alternative media, and it's not, by the way, just an alternative left-wing media. It's I think it's alternative media altogether. And I would say I took a long time to wake up to this. I entered journalism as a career, as I'm sure you did, as a in the belief that our job was to report what was going on as fairly as possibly we could manage it. And of course, you were taught to do things, present things in an exciting and readable way, to attract people's attention. But it was meant to be fair and decent. And what I no longer think is the case is that you can get a fair hearing in the British media. And by the way, I think in many ways I know Mr. Sir Keir, I should call him Sir Keir Starmer, sorry. He gets a rotten, he may not be universally popular in the Labour Party, but you won't get a great review in the Murdoch papers or the Associated Papers or the Mail paper or the Telegraph. Even Mr. Sir Keir, he gets a pretty rotten old time. So I let alone but the biggest problem which has emerged, I think now, which I do believe is new, is there are so many areas you're just simply not allowed to talk about. When I was at school, we had a rather lovely history teacher, and he brought down the political officer of the Russian embassy in about 1973. This is the height of the Cold War. And the political officer of the Russian embassy turned up at this school and gave us the Soviet view of events. And it was very enlightening, and it was, he was very, and he taught us a lot, you know, that Russia didn't, Soviet Russia, you know, had genuine grounds for grievance against the West. Here where it didn't convert us, you know, we didn't all become Bolsheviks overnight, but it was a mature kind of discourse. And I think that mature discourse was characteristic of British journalism, society, public life in that period. What has happened now is that we have a discourse where you're only allowed to have one view, and there are large areas of reporting which in the mainstream media are simply not allowed. I think I took too long to wake up to this. I mean, the first one, which is starting to change now, partly is climate change. For a long time, it was abolished as a subject matter. And this is probably the most, was beyond question, the most grievous, urgent issue of our time. And if you look at the coverage of it in the Murdoch papers, the Associated papers, it was dismissed as just a sort of a left-wing liberal concoction, including by Boris Johnson, who's suddenly in the last few weeks become a convert. And it was more, another one I've been working on enormously hard, Islamophobia. In the mainstream papers, it's not acknowledged that it exists. Even the term is mocked. You know, imagine if you said there was a problem with Islamophobia. You can't really, if you say to the Tory party there's a problem with Islamophobia, they'll say, oh, Islamophobia is a term being dreamt up to stop Muslims, by Muslims, to stop themselves being attacked. Imagine and somehow they get away with it. You know, well, you know, the Labour Party, imagine if the Labour Party said anti-Semitism is a term dreamt up in order to stop Jews being, you know, Israel being attacked. Quite rightly, the world would have gone, there would have been fury, but you can do this. And this liberates ferocious and brutal sectarian attacks on a very serious part of British society. You know, think about the fabricated Trojan horse affair, or the Tower Hamlets adoption controversy, which splashed the Times newspaper for 4 days in a row and was a fabrication. About a week or two ago, no, maybe a bit more, a month ago, I wrote a piece for Middle East Eye, which I have a political column for, about, it's just simply describing the submission by an organization called Jewish Voice for Labour, saying that and it was a well-argued submission, and it contained the rather striking statistic that if you were Jewish, you were 5 times more likely than non-Jewish people to be investigated for anti-Semitism inside the Labour Party. What was striking about this, I don't know, is nobody tried to argue with the facts, and they argued perfectly reasonably, I think this was arguably a form of anti-Semitism or harassment. Nobody tried to argue, but even just to report this, that was what was so striking. I got heavy attack just for even reporting this was a form of, was wrong. In other words, what I'm really trying to, another case in point, the Julian Assange. This doesn't exist as a story in the mainstream British papers, including The Guardian. And if you, and here we have somebody who held, for reasons which are completely obscure, in detention on his own in Belmarsh, again, for no good reason that I can see, apart from the fact that he's been, appears to have been, you know, he did us the great favor of exposing a large number of crimes committed by coalition forces in the war on terror, so-called war on terror. And not one of the papers take the slightest interest in this. I mean, this week, it does quite credible. I have no idea if they're true or not, but interesting reports that under Trump, the CIA had a look at possibly assassinating him. Well, he's on British territory, and yet that's not a story in the press. Another one I find extraordinary: lies of Boris Johnson. You have a prime minister who's got a sort of illness, really, he can't help himself, and lies all the time. And this isn't a story. This is where I start to become rather sympathetic to Keir Starmer. One occasion, Keir Starmer misled the House of Commons, and he did the proper thing. It was about 6 months ago. He said, "Sorry, I misled the Commons. I made a mistake," and he got slaughtered for it. Because even though he owned up to Johnson, it's countless the times he's misled the House of Commons. I mean, made false statements against the ruling of the ministerial code. And yet that is not a story. It is just tolerated. It's allowed. And so I, having spent a large amount of my time, most of my life, my professional life, I've had the privilege of working for the Telegraph, the Mail, the Spectator, the Evening Standard. I do now worry that something awful has happened to the British media, which wasn't the case before, that it has become it's actually become, I think, part of the government manipulation and deception machine. And that really worries me as somebody who believes, it's rather old-fashioned, but believes in free speech and free discourse. Is that enough for you, Greg?
I think that's great, Peter. I mean, I know, and we don't need to discuss it, but I suspect that our politics are not exactly the same. But then my politics are not exactly the same with most people. But what I do know is that you're an excellent journalist and a fine defender of freedom of speech, and believing that that's the future of what we want in a democracy. I came into journalism last millennium because I loved George Orwell. I wanted to be George Orwell. I wanted to write the 4,000-word article that would change the world. And on the Wakefield Express, when I met my wife to write about the national abortion campaign, and I met her through the campaign, and I'm still with her, it changed my world, and I hope it changed other people's world. But when by some accident of fate, I ended up on a newspaper that ended up being bought by Rupert Murdoch a year after I'd been outside whopping, not throwing stones, no, I wasn't throwing stones, but demonstrating, picketing against it. We were working for the capitalist press. And in those days, the way you became media was first get your 10 million pounds to build a printing press. That was the last millennium. And I really admire the way that Peter stuck at it, because Peter was there, yeah, all those titles, but he's still a voice out there, a voice that can be respected and followed on Twitter, on Facebook, on the web, at the Resist event. That's what we've got, plurality. That's our strength. And we've got to have strong people like Peter and others in this room. And I'm going to share that with two people that I admire from afar. I don't know them well. I don't know if they're journalists or if they describe themselves as a journalist, but they're from this millennium. That's the future, yeah? And I'm going to introduce Asa first, because Asa and I have known each other a few years, and Asa's work as a journalist is amazing. And I just want him to have a few words. For which, of course, he gets a lot of shit, yeah? Yeah. I think there ought to be a rule. Don't give journalists shit, right?
Thank you. Well, I mean, to reply to that a little bit, if I wasn't getting flack, if I wasn't getting shit from some people, then I would think I wasn't doing my job, I would say. Like, yeah, I mean, it comes with the territory. What I would say about building our own media, so Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Peter said about the British media. You know, it's sort of an established it's an established edifice of lies, I would say. That's the way I would put it. Building our own media is important, really, because I'm 42, and so my political education came up during the war in Iraq, the lead up to the war in Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan after 9/11. And in those days, there used to be a popular saying, which was indie media's slogan, "Don't hate the media, be the media." You know, I think there was a lot in that. And with indie media, there was a lot of good things about it. And it had a lot of weaknesses as well. Like the indie media website, Indie Media UK, it had basically an open wire, which meant that anyone could publish any old rubbish on the front page of indie media. But you know, at the same time, there was a lot of very good stuff reported. But I think the idea about the strength of indie media was that it kind of empowered movements to give their own reporting. And I think that if there's something that can be kind of salvaged out of the Corbyn years is that there is a kind of ecosphere now, I would say, of alternative media in this country, which is something to build on. So, I mean, having our own media means that our outlets need to be structurally aligned with the goals that we want to achieve. So the state and capitalist media are funded by states and corporations. So by definition, they're going to reflect the interests of those states and corporations. And that's really what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, I would say. I think it's important to reflect just how united the capitalist media was in the targeting of Jeremy Corbyn and of the movement. And I think we all know that the Guardian really led that campaign more than anyone else, I would say. The Media Reform Coalition did quite a good study about this, and they showed that in detail. And I think that there's lessons to be learned there, and that when we think about that slogan, "Don't hate the media, be the media." I mean, I think you can hate the media as well. Like, I think you can do both. You know, I think it's important to criticize bad journalism and lying journalism, and I mean, as Peter described, I would agree that it's about what can and can't be said. You know, it's about certain truths are just almost banned from speech, really. When you talk about the so-called mainstream media. So I think there's also lessons to be learned from the Corbyn years, and one of the main ones to me was that Jeremy Corbyn and the people around him we had this alternative media ecosystem, as I've described, but Corbyn and his team didn't reach out to them at all. Like they weren't embraced in any kind of way. And Corbyn only reached out to Corbyn's people only reached out to the so-called alternative media really this year, at the beginning of this year, when it was far too late, really. With his Peace and Justice project, and we had a roundtable. You know, there was discussion about what the alternative media can reach out, that what he can provide for the alternative media. But this was really far too late to make a difference to the campaign. that was mobilized against the left-wing leadership of the Labour Party. And I think it's important that when we say be the media, I mean, that includes all of you. So it's not only for journalists, it's for you as readers and as activists and as campaigners and political party members, if you are, and so forth. That when we're building up this alternative media ecosystem, it's that you should rely and promote those and don't promote The Guardian, for example. So I think it's realizing our own power in a sense that we have these outlets and we should rely on them and we should use them and we should spread those and that we should support those. We should support, all the outlets like the Squawk Box, for example, has done a really good job. It's really just a one-man operation, but he's done a really good job, Steve has, of covering the right-wing campaign against the left-wing movement that tried to make the Labour Party into something that would have policies that most of the people in the country would really want to have. We have these outlets, and it's about promoting them, I would say. So there's lessons to be learned there. So he didn't, unfortunately, this is not to just criticize him as an individual, but it was also about the people around him. There was also, he also seemed wedded to the strategy of attempting to coddle media that was always going to be opposed to him, including the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish News. I remember there was an interview with John McDonnell in the Jewish News and an interview with Jeremy Corbyn in the Jewish Chronicle at the height of the witch hunt. And it was, to me, it just seemed like a really crazy strategy. You've got this veteran campaigner of the Palestine Solidarity movement, Jeremy Corbyn, being interviewed by a paper that is incredibly anti-Palestinian. The thing I always come back to with the Jewish News specifically was the way its front page during conference in 2019, when there was all the Palestinian flags being waved, and the Jewish News responded to that, saying that it was racist, basically, saying that having the Palestinian flag was this inherently bad thing. And it was an incredibly anti-Palestinian thing to have. And the Jewish Chronicle as well, one of its, I remember, I think it was in 2014 or 2015, one of its reporters, Marcus Dish, called the Deir Yassin massacre a so-called killing of Palestinian civilians. One of the most well-attested massacres of Palestinians in 1948, but engaging in this kind of denialism. It was a really a kind of it was a really bad strategy, if there was a strategy at all, that was in place there, and it seemed to be an attempt to just placate hostile media that was never going to be placated, and instead they should have reached out to people like myself, really, and people like Peter as well. Peter only got an interview after, as far as I can tell. Is he still there?
He's still there.
No, I'm here. Yeah.
Yes, Peter. Am I right in thinking you only got an interview with Jeremy Corbyn after he was deposed as leader of the Labour Party?
I certainly got one. I think we had one David Hurst tonight, Middle East Eye, interviewed him while he was leader, but I may be wrong. He certainly interviewed him afterwards.
Okay.
I know he was pretty. He was. I mean, the Corbyn machine I found pretty easy to deal with.
Okay, so but my point is that they should have been reaching out to us more. This is my point. Like I was trying to get an interview. I mean, I've only ever had one interview with Jeremy Corbyn, and that was in 2015, in the summer of 2015, all the way through. That was when he was trying to get elected as leader of the Labour Party, and all the way through his leadership when the so-called crisis of anti-Semitism was on. I was trying to get interviews with him, but I was basically being kept away and fobbed off by his spokespeople, essentially. So, there didn't seem to be any positive strategy in place. So I think there's lessons to be learned there. And I would say that another thing that we need to learn the lessons of from the Corbyn years is that we need to learn. What we need to take away from it is two things. I would say, in terms of media, is that first of all, the entire media, as I mentioned, was united against Corbyn from the liberal, the entire so-called mainstream media, the corporate press, were really deeply unified in, first of all, opposing the left-wing leadership of the Labour Party, and secondly, saying that the membership, the activists, the movement behind him were anti-Semites, were racists, were bigoted against Jews, and it was impossible, as has been described, it was impossible to really question this. You couldn't question it and still remain in the within the mainstream narrative, which is why we saw people like Navarro Media really indulge in this. Well, let's call it what is a fabrication. It was a fabrication that the Labour Party was an anti-Semitic party, and that there was a crisis of anti-Semitism. So that's one lesson. The second lesson, I would say, is a deeper, almost a deeper one, a more difficult one to learn, which is that the British media is very deeply infiltrated by British intelligence services to an almost unique degree, really, in the world, So, I mean, and this is something that it's difficult to ascertain how much difference it made during the whole of this, but we can kind of see the broad outlines of it. And I think the British media, the so-called mainstream media, toes the line when it comes to the British security state's priorities. I mean, you only need to look at the Julian Assange case, for example, with that, the entire the campaign against Julian Assange that there has been. And I think that the so-called Labour anti-Semitism crisis is another example of that. So, there's a lot to say there. There's a lot to learn, a lot to take forward. So I would say, finally, just in closing, that the most important thing with building alternative or our media, the first and most important thing is commitment to telling the truth, and it's not, no matter who that truth is inconvenient to. And so, in that regard, it's knowing who your friends are, really, in that way. And I would say, as someone on the left, I have far more in common with Peter than with someone like Owen Jones. Yeah. So, who claims to be on the left, but threw Corbyn under the bus of the first test in 2016. And, what he was saying wasn't supported by any of the facts, So that's where I'll leave it. Thank you.
Can I just say something there, Greg?
Go, Peter. Go, Peter. Yeah.
I just to follow to sort of add to Asa's last remark. I mean, you go into politics or you go into the media, and you go into politics. It is about getting power. That is why you go into politics, and it's a perfectly honourable thing. And we need politicians. You go into journalism. It's about telling the truth. That's why you become a journalist. As Asa said, you know, no matter who it upsets. And what I find is problematic, I mean, really difficult and upsetting, is that you go to journalism and become instruments of those in power. What's the point of that? You know, you should become, without a question, by all means go into power. If you want to be the instrument of somebody in power, become one of their spin doctors, you know, be on their payroll and become the director of communications, you know, at the Treasury or something. Yeah. That's perfectly honourable. But to become the unofficial director of communications, you know, making out you're doing a sort of legitimate job as political columnist or a reporter somewhere, when actually you're the, I think that's a trouble. I think what I'm really getting at here is that there is a confusion of categories going on. That you shouldn't be, you know, you should be, you're as a member of the, as a journalist, and it's not the, you're a member of the awkward squad. You should be difficult, and you're there to tell the truth, no matter who you upset and offend. And actually, there's no other justification for it. Otherwise, we probably need more politicians and better politicians. You should go off and go into politics and make your case.
Yeah, I know Peter and I will probably agree on this, that, you know, the relationship between the journalist and the politician is the same one, it's not my phrase, as between the dog and the lamppost. Yeah. I think that was, who was it? Mencken, was it? I don't know.
Mencken.
I started in journalism with Letraset, with a manual typewriter, trying to get in straight strips and photocopying it as a Trades Council paper called Wakefield Issues whilst I was working for the Wakefield Express. And we became a trusted media outlet. And that's the important thing, trust. You trust the brand and the authority. We're not going to get rid of Murdoch. We're not going to get rid of Rothermere. We're not going to get rid of them. We are going to beat them. So when my son, at the age of 12, and I set up a bizarre website in 1995, one of the 640 websites in 1995 around the world, which put live football scores on the internet. We beat CFAX, yeah? Where's CFAX now, yeah? We beat them. Well, that's what Squawk Box will do. That's what Canary will do. That's what every media can now do. That's what the Resist event will do. And that's why we've got hundreds of people buying tickets, thousands of people watching this, and nobody reporting it. But who cares? We're going to win. They're going to exist, but we're going to win. And we win because people trust us to tell the truth to power.
Greg, the other great, that's Mencken. There's also a rather obscure regional United States journalist in the 19th century who said the job of a journalist is to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And it's such a good definition. And too many of our former colleagues see their job as exactly the other way around. They go and find the most powerful or comfortable person they can get hold of and want to suck up to them and make their life easier. And then they find somebody who's genuinely afflicted in a bad way, and they deliberately set out to go and make that person's life worse. And I don't understand that. It's not, our job is, there is a moral element in our job, and I think it was put rather well. We try and afflict the comfortable.
The closest I came to the sack, until I was sacked by Andrew Neil, was when working for the Daily Mail, our best sources, and this is then, God, it's prehistory, but 1980s, yeah? Working for the Daily Mail, our best sources were Labour MPs, if the message was right, and there still are. Peter Kyle I suggested Peter Carl and West Streeting used to have an office in the Mail on Sunday with Simon Walters, yeah? And I've had it confirmed that's almost the case, yeah? But the closest I came was someone complained that I should be sacked because I upset Roy Hattersley, who was a columnist in the Daily Mail. I mean, Peter and I sat on the Sunday Express. You get the phone call on a Friday night. It's Alistair Campbell eating his sandwich because he can't be asked to finish his salad before ringing us up and saying, we've got a scoop. Someone's given £100,000 to the Labour. You know, I'm telling tales out of school here, but sod it. Yeah, this is how it works. That's the big media. Yeah. And we've gone beyond that. You don't need your £10 million to have your printing press. Yeah. If I was in the Wakefield Issues newsroom now, it wouldn't be Letraset and manual typewriters. It would be the web and it would be all that sort of stuff that we're doing today. Yeah. But enough of that from those of us of a certain age who lived in the last millennium. We now have real world examples of people who can create, communicate, influence and change. And I'm so delighted to have someone like Lowkey in our meeting tonight.
Thank you very much. Well, I think it's worth expanding upon the Daily Mail group, what it is and what actually it owns, because I think that a lot could be understood about our society through that lens. Well, Jonathan Rothermere obviously inherited it from his father through a Jersey trust, and it's, you know, through a Bermuda registered offshore entity. He's worth 760 million pounds. And the chairman of the Daily Mail group is Paul Dacre. Now, just for some context, Paul Dacre described the BBC as institutionally Marxist, and Downing Street is attempting to make Paul Dacre the head of Ofcom. Now, it's failed in the first situation because despite being pushed quite hard by the government, the panelists said he didn't quite meet the requirements. Now, instead of the government allowing that ruling to stand, they have basically given him a second try for Paul Dacre to meet the panelist requirements. Now, what exactly does Daily Mail Group own? It obviously owns the Daily Mail. It owns the Metro. It used to own Evening Standard. It owns a stake in ITN, which is the company that produces the news, not just for ITV, but Channel 4 and Channel 5 as well. How does it make sense that somebody who is the chairman of this organization that has this much power in the media should be the head of Ofcom? In what kind of society? This is not cronyism. This is corruption. That in fact, I would hazard that an uncorrupt kind of arrangement would be the aberration of what we've seen, certainly in my lifetime, of British history. What about News Corp? Well, you know, it came out that Rupert Murdoch effectively avoided paying any corporation tax in Britain for over 11 years. You've seen basically News Corp being able to, in the 90s, while other organizations in the United States like Walt Disney, Time Warner, and Viacom were paying a tax rate that ranged between 27.2% to about 32%. In the US, News Corp were able to get away with paying 5.7%. Also, you know, they have quite a complicated network of subsidiaries that put the money in the Cayman Islands and Bermuda. What exactly does News Corp own? Sky News, Talk Sport, Talk Radio, Virgin Radio, The Sun, The Times, The Sunday Times. They're also a shareholder in the Press Association, the New York Post, Wall Street Journal. News Corp also owns HarperCollins, you know, one of the big 5 publishers. As a charity, when it comes specifically to this issue around anti-Semitism and Jeremy Corbyn, we have to be clear when it comes to Murdoch that the News Corp Foundation actually funded the Jerusalem Foundation, which builds in settlements in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan in Palestine. You also have, and that's included in the Jerusalem Foundation's own annual reports, but also Rupert Murdoch, alongside Dick Cheney and the former director of the CIA, James Woolsey, who was instrumental in the beginning of the Henry Jackson Society, and also the former US Treasury head, Larry Summers. And imagine this, the former Energy Secretary of the United States, Bill Richardson. All of these people are on the board of Genie Energy, which is an oil and gas company. Obviously, when it comes to Murdoch Media's reporting of the climate change, you have to take into account that this is somebody that sits on the board of an oil and gas company. But in addition to that, this company, Genie Energy, were given a contract by the Israeli government to develop oil and gas in the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights in Syria. What about the BBC? Well, we know that the current chairman, Richard Sharp, not only donated £400,000 to the Conservative Party before becoming the chairman, he also supported the now entirely discredited fake news factory Quilliam Foundation. He also funded Chatham House, which also is funded by BAE Systems, Lockheed Martin, and the US State Department. What about the Director General of the BBC currently, Tim Davie? He stood as a councillor for the Conservative Party in Hammersmith and was actually the deputy chairman of the Tory party there in the 90s. We also know, as many of the people who are here were present in the previous talk, that the BBC has a history of allowing the British security services to vet its employees, meaning that if you had a family member who was in the Socialist Workers' Party, you were likely to be vetted by MI5, and the BBC would be told, no, don't employ this person. What is, bizarre to me is that simultaneous to what seemed to be some of Jimmy Savile's worst crimes at the BBC, you had the security services inside the BBC, literally vetting people that worked in makeup and the wardrobe department of the BBC. When we look at the Koch brothers, their influence in Britain is nowhere near what it is in the United States, but there's still something significant that people should know about. When you take into account that the Koch brothers' wealth initially came from their father building an oil refinery for the Nazi government in Germany, and much like the other corporations who were present in Nazi-controlled Germany at that time, from Volkswagen to Coca-Cola to Ford, rather than being cancelled, quote unquote, as the new sort of marketing ploy, what happened were they were given compensation, as the rest of these companies were, for sites of theirs that were hit in bombing by the Allies in World War II. Obviously, before one of the Koch brothers died, if their two fortunes were to be put together, that would equal the richest person in the world. In terms of the fossil fuel industry, it gets about $5.5 trillion per year of subsidy. Now, that's a real status quo to protect, isn't it? Well, they've given hundreds of thousands of dollars to Spiked Online in this country. You also have to remember that simultaneous to Standing Rock protests against the pipeline, which the Koch brothers had a direct interest in, Spiked Online, the Koch brothers funded website, were publishing articles that were attempting to discredit the protesters. And in fact, David Koch said, if we're going to give a lot of money, we'll make darn sure they spend it in a way that goes along with our intent. And if they make a wrong turn and start doing things we don't agree with, we withdraw funding. So remember that Donors Capital Fund and Donors Trust, these organizations are known to be funnels for the Koch brothers. Particularly, for several years, the Koch brothers were identified as the largest funders of these organizations. Now, these organizations also funded the Center for Security Policy, which was responsible for the Muslim ban. It gave Trump the blueprint for it and was even given a big up by the White House in their press release on the announcing of the Muslim ban. They also funded the Middle East Forum, which funded Tommy Robinson. So when you then look at an organization like Spiked Online and their articles, it doesn't surprise you that they've had 12 articles supporting Tommy Robinson, because in one way or another, they are plugged in to the same kind of movement. I mean, I've said it before, but I think it is worth looking at global media And, because LBC performed, there's the space within LBC to assimilate Nigel Farage, kind of Katie Hopkins at one point, it looked like. There's also space to assimilate David Lammy, who of course is the recipient of funds from the Israel lobbyist Trevor Chin, but there would never be space within that place to assimilate the kind of mildly redistributive ideas of Jeremy Corbyn. And when we look at Ashley Tabor King, who runs global media, he was again given it by his father, Michael Tabor. It's registered in Jersey and pays no corporation tax. When we look and we try to deduce what are this man's politics, okay? You look at his charity, the Ashley Tabor King Foundation. It funds a mysterious military organization, Tar Mor, which means big house in Gaelic, which promotes the efficiency of the armed forces and the crown servants. On the board of the global media is also Stephen Mirren, who is also on the board of the charity. But simultaneous to that, despite the fact that this organization, Global Media, owns many radio stations, literally its CEO is on the board of Universal Music, which is one of the record labels who will derive profit from how often their song is played on some of these radio stations. Who else is at this organization? The chairman of Global Media is Charles Allen, Lord Allen of Kensington, thanks to Ed Miliband. What else does Charles Allen do apart from sitting in the House of Lords, scrounging over £300 a day off of every single person in this room, thanks to Ed Miliband? Charles Allen is also the chairman of a cleaning and catering company, ISS, which has benefited massively from NHS privatization, particularly through PFI schemes. Also, you have on the board of the charity, Henry Stephen Jones, who has roles on the board of several different companies, from Together All to Aconics. These companies have contracts with the US Defense Department and with the Ministry of Defense. So essentially what we're talking about is an orthodoxy, which is servility, and that's on the ownership level. When we look at the journalistic level, in my mind, I believe that servility for access is the order of the day. You have through things like the D-Notice Committee, you have through these kind of relationships that are set up, a way in which journalists basically will render themselves stenographers, not necessarily in terms of covering historical events where there isn't much at stake. It's almost like declassified documents. When it comes to things happening right now, there seems to be this across the board general obedience. Now, social media obviously has thrown a spanner in the works to some extent, but that is also limited and also has a lot of the kind of monopoly logic behind it. So I'd like to look at it this way. In Palestine, between 2015 and 2018, you had over 500 Palestinians, among them children, arrested for posts that they made on Facebook. Now, the organization within the IDF, which is tasked with monitoring the communications of Palestinians, is Unit 8200. Now, Whitney Webb did a wonderful investigation into social media giants and the extent to which Unit 8200, former Unit 8200 employees were working within them. She identified 28 former Unit 8200 members working at Google. She identified 15 working at Microsoft, and she identified 13 working at Facebook. When we look also at the extent to which the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, which in the 60s, the FBI in their own internal memos were questioning whether it violated the Registration of Foreign Agents Act. And it, I quote from this FBI memo, It is incredible to assume that what the ADL does is not furnished by the Israeli government. Of course, by then, the FBI was already collaborating with the ADL, and today the ADL is the largest non-governmental law enforcement trainer in the United States. But when it comes to social media and the ADL, what are we talking about? We are talking about the ADL having a Silicon Valley command center funded by Pierre Omidyar, of course, a shareholder in PayPal and the founder of eBay. What you have now is the ADL not only becoming a trusted flagger for YouTube, whereby they can censor stuff that gets too pro-Palestinian, but also you have the ADL working with PayPal in examining extremists and their sources of funding. So we've got to a point where, as I mentioned earlier, you could actually have on Have I Got News for You, Finn Taylor, a comedian in Britain, say that he hoped all Corbyn supporters could gather in Glastonbury so they could all be bombed, to riotous applause and laughter. You also, in addition to that, have the Board of Deputies, which militated relentlessly against every single one of you in this building, announce in their trustees report of 2020 that they have a close working relationship with the Israeli embassy, their words, not mine, and that they have strengthened links with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs in Israel and with the IDF, and not one word is mentioned within our servile media. And so how do we get to the point where, according to polls, you have 1 in 5 young people thinking that there is this unresolvable conflict between Islam and the West? Where do we get to the point where 14% of 18 to 30-year-olds believe that in Britain today, there are quote unquote no-go areas where Sharia law operates? Where do we get to the point where literally you have more than 1 in 10 young white people have the impression that white people are actually a minority in Britain, despite the fact that they are 86% of the population? Where do we get to the point where literally 1 in 5 young white people in the country believes that the country is under threat from invasion, despite the fact that refugees are only 0.18% of the population? How does this take place? What about the rest of us? Those who don't believe we want to live in a society where people die in debt and families even inherit their debt because they can't pay back their education? What about those that believe that education, housing, and healthcare are actually human rights, rather than mere ideas to be turned into profit by debt creation? What about the 77% of the British public who support a ban on nuclear weapons globally? What about the 77% of this public that want public ownership of energy? The 76% of the public that want railways in public ownership? What about the 83% of the British public that want water in public ownership? What about those of us who believe that we don't believe an institution like the Environment Agency should only get 0.13 to 0.16% of the annual budget from our government? Where are we represented in the media? You have 6.6 million members of trade unions in this country. That is around 10% of the population. Why is the money that is going through the trade unions not turning into media? Why do we not have that powerful backing to disseminate our ideas that the majority of the population would support? Thank you.
I would say let's take 2 minutes. The first minute for applause, and the second minute just to take in all that. Yeah. It'll be on the web. We'll regurgitate it, etc. Yeah. For goodness me. Yeah. Let's just think about that. Please give me applause. say two or three things that reflect on me and people who criticise me for working for capitalist media. It's an accident. Most of my life's been an accident. It's all been an accident, really. I want to be George Orwell writing for The Guardian. Thank God I never wrote for The Guardian. Otherwise, I'd be with Owen Jones and all those other liberals. Liberals, you can't stand liberals. I can stand Tory journalists, I can stand socialist journalists, but liberals, Jesus. Yeah. Well, I had the privilege of being interviewed by Ben Bradley for the Washington Post scholarship, 1980 something. Gary Young was one of them, but other people were, and I wish I'd gone there because I was inspired not just by George Orwell, but by All the President's Men. It's a dream, it's a fantasy now, yeah? It's a fantasy, but there are other opportunities. When young journalists come to me, when I used to be still in print, Brighton Hove Independent, etc., I didn't say go to get Telegraph Mail and be in dead print and Mail Online and do all that crap, yeah? I'd want a son of mine, a daughter of mine to be Lowkey. I'd want them to be Asa. I'd want to be all those voices out there.
He's up there, it's better than us. He's up there, he's up there, he's up there.
Yeah, well, he's I'm incredibly proud of him, but you know. Anyway, he wouldn't have been here if he wasn't making it work. But no, seriously, I mean, the generation of people born in 1986 when I was 30 is the future, yeah? We've done our bit, but technology's moved on, right? But there are two things I'm proud of. One, I worked for the Daily Mail. I worked for the Daily Mail when Paul Dacre published Murderers with 5 murderers of Stephen Lawrence. I was on one of the minor peripheral of that. And the fact that Stephen Lawrence's father was decorating Paul Dacre's house and had a conversation and all that didn't matter to me. God, I was proud, yeah? I was proud to be at the Sunday Times by accident. Murdoch bought Today newspaper from some other spiff. And I thought, if Murdoch owns me, I'll move to the Sunday Times. And I sat opposite the person who talked and guarded, not very well, Mordecai Vanunu, who was the whistleblower who said Israel has got nuclear secrets and ludicrously put him in a safe house, took him to Italy, and Mossad kidnapped him. And he's still there. He's still in touch with me, right? Don't tell me that Mossad doesn't operate abroad because they kidnap people. Don't tell me when I have worked for 2 newspapers where I know there are MI6, MI5 agents in the newsroom, not just contacts, agents in the newsroom. And I would name them if they still mattered, but it doesn't matter. None of this is a conspiracy. Capitalism isn't a conspiracy. Capitalism is a collation of facts that Lowkey's just gone through. You've just got to understand it. But what you've got to be is media savvy. Read the Daily Mail. I get the Daily Mail because you've got to know what's happening. You've got to know that Keir Starmer is briefing this to Daily Mail readers. You've got to read well, I don't read the Guardian. I mean, Jesus. But you've got to read the Morning Star. You've got to read the Web. You've got to read Asa. You've got to read Lowkey, because actually we've moved away from the big Lord Rothermere Murdoch titles, the brand. We've moved on to trusted people. If Jackie Walker says something, if Lowkey says something, if Asa says something, I believe it. I believe it more than if I read it in the Daily Mail or in the Telegraph or whatever. So you've got to analyze all that, but you've got to know the facts. And you've got to read the facts and be media savvy. This wasn't easy. Lowkey knows stuff. And he deserves for us to understand stuff. Because what happens is if you don't understand stuff, everyone just says anti-Semite. They just say conspiracy theorist. They just say abuse. Because we win on facts, we win on argument, we win on media. But they currently, for the moment, win on power. But we're going to resist. And we're not just going to resist, we're going to step forward and win. Anyway.
Got a mic up there.
Sorry,
Sorry, are you going out? Yes. Okay.
There's a few people were emoting out there. Okay. Can you see, Becky?
Yes, I can see.
There we are. There's a long-standing member here, audience member here. He said hello to me last night.
Hello. Thank you, all three of you, for all four of you, for a marvelous presentation. There's definitely a book in Lowkey's particular revelations, and I think Peter Oborne has a good publisher because I bought his book of the lies of Boris Johnson. So maybe they can get together and publish some of the research that Lowkey's done. I'm speaking as a recovering broadcast journalist. So I worked for, well, before that I was in FT magazines writing about tax dodging, and then at ITN for a few years, and then CNN, and then I went freelance, and then into freelance newspapers. One of the biggest media stories of the last decade was the Levinson inquiry into what happened with the News of the World. And only one half of that investigation was completed. And that was into the standards of the journalism that led to such an appalling situation. And it was largely unremarkable what was found. And of course, we got the pleasure of seeing Murdoch squirming. But the second half of that investigation was put on the back burner and, what's the expression, kicked into the long grass. It's vitally important for any credibility in the British media for the second half of that to be brought back into Parliament and investigated. And the reason for that is that what was really important, the reason why Murdoch's tabloids were trying to expose all those sensational stories and hacking people's phones, and not just Murdoch, but Piers Morgan at the Mirror, who has never been brought to book for what he did and for his share tipping scandal, etc. The reason they were doing that was political, because if they could sell lots of copies of their rags with these scurrilous stories, they could then do a deal with whichever political party they wanted to do a deal with, and the deal would be, in Murdoch's case, about relaxing the media ownership rules so that he could buy more of Sky, and he doesn't own all of Sky. I think he's got 40% of Sky News anyway. And in Rothermere's case, so that he could buy more titles and have online domination of our media. And that's why they wanted these sensational stories. And that's why we need to break that link between political influence, and we had Bernard Ingham admitting that they sat in a room with the editor of the Sunday Times and Murdoch and Thatcher and carved up a deal for that very influential newspaper that you worked on. I'm a member of the NUJ. I want to see my union doing more to uphold its ethical standards in the newsroom at the editorial level and stand up to bosses. And unfortunately, our members are all being persecuted and the wages and conditions driven down in the media industry, in the news industry. And all these courses, and I'll wind up quickly, all these degrees are still being promoted on media studies, and you get, if you're wealthy, you can get an internship on a London newspaper or whatever. It's just not working. So the NUJ really has to show, Michelle Stanistreet has to show some backbone and back the calls for Leveson too. Just very briefly, I love your enthusiasm, Greg, about the new media, the technological revolution that Paul Mason's talked about, but where is the results of that? We're still seeing tabloid newspapers backing Johnson to the hilt despite his abject failure in every realm. And really, it is all about the media. That's why this session is so important. And I wish there was more coverage of it at the World Transformed, etc. But they preferred to talk about culture today. And I was very disappointed that my question about media was not answered. So thank you. I'm Bruce Whitehead, a recovering broadcast journalist.
Yeah, I used to introduce myself as Greg Hadfield, a recovering journalist. before Becky, I'd just like to bring in Peter Oborne, because I'm intrigued to know what Peter's view is of Leveson before we come back to the audience. Because I think he and I may have heterodox views, but let's see. Let's see if he's still there, Peter.
Yeah, I'm still, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think that it is a pity we didn't have Leveson too. If you remember the reason we needed it, there were a number of criminal trials, I think I'm right in saying, or investigations going in during Leveson 1. So the police act, the criminal element of the Leveson inquiry was not accounted for in Leveson 1. And I think the links between the media and the police and politicians, which was what we never learnt about, which I think would have been valuable, would have been essential.
So one of the things I just feel about that is Facebook, the editorial role that Facebook is now taking, Twitter, and many people here are victims of it. And they're not journalists. Yeah, the editorial role that Facebook, Twitter, and even the networks are taking is the biggest threat to freedom of speech at the moment. Yeah, I mean, to people being cancelled, if that's the right word, but basically just being censored. And there's no control over that, there's no appeal. And that's because we're meshed in a network, a technological network. The resistevent.com is on one server and the domain is on another. Because I know there are people who want to stifle us. And then the Eventbrite is on another, and this, that, and the other is on another, because if you disperse and you have a dispersed network, but if you just reside on Facebook or Twitter, they can switch you off. That's a big problem. And therefore, I'm very wary about restricting the freedom of speech, freedom of information, even when they're talking crap, right? I think that's important. You've got to understand that. And remember, I've done illegal things as a journalist, yeah, in the public interest, because you're allowed to. I'm hacked phones and all that stuff, you know, but this stuff, we'll talk about in the bar. But the laws about libel, the laws about hacking were largely, the effect was largely to defend rich, famous people against rich media owners who are playing some game way above us. But oh no, if you get slagged off in the Daily Mail because you're a working class black woman, page lead, try taking that on, yeah? Try getting Ofcom, try getting Ipso, try getting anyone interested, try getting Paul Dacre interested. They're not interested. That's not the law that defends us. That's not Leveson. That's not libel. We've got to stop that. And I agree with our friend over there, Bruce. When I was active in the NUJ at local newspapers, I wanted the printers. Do you remember the printers when we had printers? Yeah. The print unions and the NUJ used to talk in federated chapels about defending the rights of readers and users and workers against the total absolute editorial control of the editor or the owners in Northcliffe or wherever. That's the future. Now you can't do that in Facebook. I wish you could. Can you imagine Facebook being unionized? Yeah. Can you imagine Google being unionized? Wouldn't it be fantastic? Twitter being unionized? Yeah, it's not going to happen. So we've got to build our own networks. I was going to bring along a book called Disaster. And it was News on Sunday in 1987. Yeah, it was 1987. And it was John Pilger and his others. And we had a newspaper that came out every Sunday. That's why it's called News on Sunday. And it was terrible. Yeah, terrible. And it was a disaster. There were big issues about governance, about owning the printing press, about paying for it, etc. Issues of governance are still important. I wanted to have here Unity TV. Yeah, that would have been great. Wouldn't it be great if a trade union movement decided on having a multimedia printed, etc., etc., or the Morning Star became open and democratic and unionized and accountable to the working class movement. Yeah, all that would be great. But at the moment, we've got single lone fantastic voices like Squawkbox, Lowkey, Asa, etc., in networks, and that's what we need. Let's not be distracted by Leveson or libel or whatever. It's important, but let's just build forward.